for this computer. Okay, great, we're started. So, so before we get into this week's workshop, did want to show where we're depositing all the code. So you're seeing my screen right now on GitHub, right? And so the code that we'll be using for this workshop is troubleshooting web pages. So everyone, if you could download this Python file, and you could do that by downloading the zip file and then extracting the zip file, or just clicking this. And here's all the code. You could just copy paste it into, I think you could copy paste it. Yeah, copy paste it into your IDE. I don't know, does that make sense to everyone? I'm gonna wait a little bit just to have everyone do that. So I'll just send the link to this in the chat right now. So yeah, let me know once you have gotten this Python file opened in your open in Spider or whatever interface you're using. Stop sharing for a moment. Is everyone all set?
So I have the first part of the code in, and then I can pull up the Chrome driver, but I'm not sure what else.
I guess I just want to have it all ready. So
yeah. Okay.
I'll share my screen right now. And so it should look like this, right? Or something like this, like the script is right here and all the code is right here that I put together for this workshop. So I think, I'm assuming everything's good. So so for this workshop, we'll be getting into learning how to troubleshoot and well, different strategies and how to troubleshoot problems that come up when web scraping, because well, inevitably, I think using the functions or methods to like open up your web driver, extract something from your extract what's on the website, that's just like maybe half the battle, or maybe even like 20% of the battle, honestly. The other part that like you're inevitably going to be spending a lot of your time trying to diagnose problems that come up because of how finicky a lot of this is. And I think it's important for us to kind of go over slowly some best practices in your code and some things to keep in mind when you're choosing to web scrape. And so I guess first of all, I do want to touch upon a little bit on like the ethics and legality of web scraping, because that's something that gets into other issues that will be important when we're coding. And I do recommend before you kind of web scrape to spend a little bit of time looking up and skimming through what are some general best practices and whatnot. There's a lot of resources out there about like the intricacies of the ethics and legality of it. I think for us as researchers, it's a little different because a lot of the time it could be like private companies extracting data from other private companies. And that's going to be like, that's a whole different ballgame from what we're doing, which is extracting data for research. Um, and this gets into the fact that in general, when you're accessing websites, you technically agree to the terms of service. And most websites have this sort of terms of service that have instructions on like whether or not that have instructions on saying like give whether or not you're able to web scrape the page. So, and a lot of these instructions are generally in something known as a robots.txt file. And I've included more of an explanation here, but I think we mentioned this before in a couple workshops ago. But basically, these are like the instructions to tell web scrapers to give instructions on what is scrapable, what is not scrapable, as like things that are allowed or not allowed. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time taking a look at it. So I just got up the YouTube robots.txt file. And usually it's like something like this, in which there's, I think the most important part is sort of a user agent, which refers to instructions for any sort of web scraper. And this sort of disallow line that basically says, as it says, what the web scraper itself, the user agent, is not allowed to scrape. In this case, YouTube, they have a little funny segment at the top, I think referencing Terminator, if I'm not mistaken. But they have this sort of user agent for Google. So this is like, I think Google's web scraper. And I think this means that they allow the Google web scraper to web scrape anything on the website. But for all other web scrapers, that's us, this is what the star notifies as everyone else. They recommend, they disallow you to web scrape these sort of parts of the website itself. It's of the URL, like I don't know, Scott, am I right or wrong on that?
No, you're fine. I just wanted to catch up Jacob because he just joined us.
And
okay. So Jacob, we're working off the troubleshooter Python script here. It's available on the GitHub for the web scraping workshop. And right now we're just going over what is contained on robots.txt files and how it informs kind of the limitations on your web scraping.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, sorry I'm late. I ended up sleeping through my first alarm, so.
No problem. No, good to have you. Thanks for coming to this awesome session that we have. And so, so yeah, like every website has a robots.txt file, and it is good to like at least look through or know the basics of it. And sometimes robot.txt files will also have a like a line that says, I guess how many times you're allowed to, like a rate limit to how many times you're allowed to access a web page. So it doesn't look so that like, okay, if the robots.txt file might say something along the lines of only allow you to access this web page every couple of seconds or something, you're able to like implement that in your code because you're basically following the terms of service. And I guess legally through web scraping more broadly, it's generally in a gray area of whether or not you're allowed to web scrape. I think for the most part, because all of this is technically public information, a lot of this is easy to do and people just do it anyway. But it's also to keep in mind the sort of the instructions that websites give you, because you're technically This might not be as important for like big websites like YouTube or Amazon, because you could web scrape all you want and you won't really wreck their servers. But for smaller websites, it might be a problem if you were to access their pages too much. You might crash their website. This is also, even though I don't think there's a lot of good enforcement mechanisms that websites can have for like individual researchers, as long as you're doing things within reason. The worst thing that they could do is kind of block your IP address, and your IP address is like the unique address that every user has when you're accessing websites. It's the address that it's the address that servers on the other end know. It's the address used that they're able to uniquely identify you as a unique user. The worst thing they could do is kind of identify, if you're doing any abnormal activities, they can identify your IP address and kind of like block you, which is, it's not as bad as being sued, definitely, but it's kind of annoying. So just some things to keep in mind. Let's see. Gonna go back to this. And the second thing I want to direct a lot of you to is something that is documentation. So going from that link into the Python script over here. And so I think Will gave you a really great set of functions and methods and code for you to use to access websites, to open up Selenium web browser, extract certain bits of elements on a web page. And that's a good start, but I also think for your own future reference, with Selenium and every other programming language, usually a lot of them have really good documentation. I think Selenium, Python document, the Selenium document has really good documentation on like, what do they have here? For instance, I think over here, like navigating a web page and locating elements, I'll just click this one here, have like literally a list of all like a lot of methods that you could use on your own to extract elements. So like if there's something here that's not in the code that Will gave, it will be here basically. Like if you're wondering, how do I select something based upon a class name or an XPath, they kind of give you examples here. And there's a lot of examples that you could see that they give you. So know that there's a lot of resources out there that you could look through on your own. So I'm going to point that out to you as a resource before we get into sort of nitty-gritty stuff about codes. So I think that's good. And
do you want to take just a few moments here to talk a little bit about how you might use that kind of resource file that you were just showing? Because some of the people probably aren't going to be as familiar with HTML or navigating it, so it might help to walk through a little bit more.
Yeah, I could go through. You mean going through like one example or something?
Yeah, just I think, talk a little bit about how you might use this to debug things if you were kind of encountering an issue.
Yeah. So I think this might not be as useful to debug things as to tell you what are the functions going on. I think to figure out how to debug, well, there are like stuff like no element exceptions. A lot of this are descriptions of like, here's an example of what this will look like, and here's an example of how to access, how to use this method, find element by ID with login form. And so it selects the element with login form, for example, over here. And so I think you would be able to do this, like you would be able to like use these examples of like how to actually use these elements successfully and be able to apply them to your specific case. And I think what generally I do when whenever I encounter errors, which we will encounter in later on when we run through some of the code, like a lot of the time, like honestly, a lot of people just search up Stack Overflow, sorry, for questions. And so whenever you encounter an error and you don't know what's going on, Stack Overflow is a really good resource because it's basically a place where computer programmers ask questions about why their code broke or things that they're having trouble on. For instance, can't find can't open Selenium in the browser or something. Search that here. Are you a human being? Well, that's kind of funny because this is a CAPTCHA. Well, basically, it's a repository where you could ask questions, or you could ask questions about what code you're having. If you literally have an error in your code, you could copy paste it here. And a lot of the times, a lot of questions have been asked before, if that makes sense. And this is kind of what I do, like whenever I try and run code, from the documentation here. And if something doesn't work out or I'm not able to figure something out, I literally just search up in Stack Overflow. And that's something that a lot of people honestly do. And this is where you would be able to find code and try and debug your code by figuring out like what actually is wrong. Because a lot of the time, good answers here are explained really well and give you like code that should actually run as well. And so the workflow that I kind of want to give to you is kind of try running through your code, putting it together, and then seeing what errors come up, and then Google. If you can't figure that out, it's fine. That happens to everyone. That happens to me all the time as well. To Google what's wrong, basically, and usually you're able to find something that's on Stack Overflow and whatnot, and that's basically how a lot of people troubleshoot their code. I think you could go further into the documentation of Selenium, but I mostly just use this website, for instance, as a way to figure out what are the methods out there that I could use. I think there are more. There's more like, I think there are definitely more like documentation with regards to like what these specific elements are composed of, but I won't get into that here.
One thing, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
One way that you can use documentation like this is that you can find that as you're trying to do something on a website, as you're trying to click a button, as you're trying to interact with a web element or extract information from it, for whatever reason, something won't work. And we sort of run into this issue of like, okay, I'm trying to find it by name and name isn't working. Then you can just go down the list. You can try by XPath, you can try by link text, partial link text. Once you get the sort of idea of how these things work, it's fairly easy to sort of iterate through a lot of these methods to find elements. One of the things that happened in the last workshop is there were a number of elements that I had to go through that process with, where I couldn't interact with it by XPath, I couldn't interact with it by CSS selector, and I just went down the list, and for whatever reason, partial link text seemed to work. And one thing that's important about this is we don't always really need to know the nitty-gritty of why these things work. We don't have to be Python devs. We don't have to be website developers. The really, really fine-grained detail of how and why Selenium is affecting them, is affecting whatever our effort is, that's a little beyond what we really have to know. And if you just sort of iterate through these different methods, you can figure out pretty easily, like, okay, these things can work. For whatever reason, these couple things didn't. And the documentation can help a lot with that, especially with their examples. When they go through their examples, you can effectively just copy and paste it and just use their model for your web page. And it's pretty simple from there. And you can do the same thing with the Stack Exchange. You just sort of Google, I can't click on a button on this web page. What's going on? Stack Exchange. And thousands of people have had the same problem. And there are dozens of individual questions that pop up. And you can just grab their code, copy and paste it into your code, and then see if it works on your web page.
No, exactly. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I hope that gives everyone a sense of the resources that are out there. Like if you have any problems, like you could use documentation to, like, you know, basically go through to see what are some methods or functions that you could use to extract certain bits of data for the website that you might have difficulty on with other methods. But and to like know how to know what are good websites. Like Stack Overflow is a really great one to look through, like see what are also similar problems that people have had, because usually the problems that we have are problems that other people have had before, and so they've asked the questions already. So you're basically and people answered those questions already, and Stack Overflow is a great repository for all of that. So for the remainder of the workshop, I'm going to go through a couple of other not really errors, but like things to keep in mind to optimize your web scraper a lot more. And I'll explain some of them along the way. So the first one that I want to talk about are something known as user agent strings. And this is something we talked about before, but to be more specific, user agent strings are they're descriptions of your browser that website servers use to identify what devices you're using. And so, for instance, Mozilla Firefox or Chrome have their own user agents associated with them. And I think there's more specific things like what OS you're using, whether you're using Mac or Windows, or what other specific specific things in your hard drive that are used, hardware and software that you're using, that are usually located here. And you could search up your own user agent string, I think, if you just Google it online. And these are important because I think not all websites do this, but some websites actually check what user agent you're using. And if they detect that you're using a user agent that's opening up in Python that Selenium WebDriver is using. I think by default, the Selenium WebDriver uses some sort of Python user agent string. And that's something that you should keep in mind, because if, you know, sometimes savvy website developers don't want you to web scrape, so they kind of block you from doing things if you don't set your user agent string. And this is just like a string that you could literally just put in. Like, for instance, I found this off of the internet, the user agent string for Mozilla Firefox, and you could set this into options, into the options. You could set your options when you open up a Chrome driver, and just when you open up your Chrome, you include it in your options, basically. Oh, I think my mouse broke, so I have to. The batteries of my mouse just went off, so I have to replace it right now. Great timing. Okay. Bear with me. But you could try running the code right now. I'll do that in a second. There we go. It's working now. Perfect. That is really annoying. But yeah, let's run this code right now, and I could just press Control Enter to run this code. So this sets up your Chrome profile, and we're going to go to a website and try and download an image from this website. So I'm going to run it now. So I've already set the user agent string in Selenium. So that's what it does. It doesn't show anything unique on your end, but it's just something that's in the back end. So yeah, we are able to access this website successfully. And so basically, what I want to do is I want to go to this website and download this image onto my hard drive somewhere. And so, this might be something simple to do. Right. This is something we've seen before. We would, ideally right-click this, inspect the element, figure out that this is the element we want to select. We copy this. We copy the CSS selector or the XPath, and then we would paste it into the element right here. And we would paste the CSS selector right here with this driver find element method. And this is something I also want to let you know that a lot of the time websites do change. And so when you want to write code, you want to keep in mind that sometimes if you are developing a web scraper that goes to a certain website and tries to select the top 10, like for instance, the headlines in the New York Times front page, you might encounter some problems like a lot of websites change. A lot of websites are dynamic and they change every day. So the CSS selectors or the XPaths or even the other ways to find elements can break. And that's kind of an annoying thing. And I think this is, in order to have like something that's stable over time, like be able to have a selector that's stable over time, I think it generally requires a lot of experimentation. We won't get into that for this lecture, for this workshop, but that's something to keep in mind, that sometimes the CSS selectors that you find might not seem to be stable. And I don't think this one seems to be stable because it uses indexing here. And that basically means that if the location of this image changes into like the 20th item in the list instead of the 19th item in the list, you won't select the right element. So that's something that's kind of annoying that I think to keep in mind because websites are constantly changing. But at least in this case, we're able to use it for the purposes of this exercise. We selected the element. It looks like that ran successfully. And so we're going to get the attribute, the href, which is the URL link to the image. So we ran that code, we ran that line, and we're going to run print output URL. And I'm going to copy paste this. And yeah, that's perfect. This is what we want. It's so now we have the URL link to what we want basically. And now let's try downloading this image. And the way that I've done it is not through Selenium, but through this other library called urllib.request library that I imported above here. And this should come default to your system, I think. So we're gonna run the file name, and this is basically, you could set this up to be you could set this path to be wherever you want the image to be download at. So this is like the path where we're going to download this image. And now we're going to run this, this one right here. So, well, first of all, this line retrieves the image from this URL that we have, and then downloads it into this file path right here. And so after running that code, we figure out that we ran into a problem called raise HTTP error. So I'm going to use this as an exercise to show you what happens when something doesn't work. It's like, wait a moment, this code does seem to work. It worked for other cases for me, but I don't know why it's raising this error. So let's try and Google it right now, actually. So this is generally what I would do, just Google. A bunch of links should pop up, but Stack Overflow is one of them, for instance. So I'm going to click this right here. Okay, so this person was trying to download manga Japanese comics, which is probably really funny. And so they encountered this similar problem. Any suggestions on how I could solve this problem? Help would be appreciated. So, this is the case of someone encountering this problem exactly. Here's their code. You can see it's pretty similar to what we're doing, and they ran into this problem. And I think one of the solutions that, this doesn't look like, yeah, here we go. One person mentioned here that it's a forbidden error, means the URL you entered require authentication. You're not allowed to access it until you authorize it yourself. It looks like this isn't as useful, but you could probably find others as well. But you could probably find like other sort of similar errors that you could look through to figure out what is going on. But to skip that, basically what I've already looked through this, and basically what happened is that we got error. The website detected that we were using I think a Python, the Python default user agent, and figured out that we were a bot, and so blocked us basically. And this is why having a concept of what a user agent is so important, because knowing that now, we could kind of specify our own user agent. So urllib.request has its own built-in method to set your own user agent, the following code that I think I found online somewhere. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to run this, which I think it installs the opener. So it sets the preferences for our urllib.request. And now we're able to basically run this line, which is the same line right here. And it worked. So this should have opened up in your working directory. I'm just going to show you that image on my laptop to just show you that it worked. So scripting workshop. I think I saved mine here in example. So I'm going to open this up and come on, don't fail me. Yeah, there we go. That's the image that we just downloaded basically. And I think you already downloaded if you ran this code the way above. So that's like one sort of exercise to show you like the path, the sort of flow chart that I would go through, and that you would run code that typically you think would work, but sometimes you run into errors that we just all run into. In this case, it was a user agent problem that we just had to specify with these few lines of code. So I'm going to also close this WebDriver session, and I think it's good practice to close your sessions with this WebDriver. So when we open a WebDriver, we kind of set the WebDriver to a variable. In this case, we called it driver. You can name this anything you want, like my driver or my best driver, but we just called it driver for short. And so generally you want to close every driver per session. It's like the same rationale of not wanting to have like 10 browsers open at once for your own self as like an organizational issue. So it's best practice to close it. So we're going to close it. And oh, I think okay, let's try and close this again. Okay, what happened? Okay, well, I made a mistake there by opening up another tab, but basically this this line closes every web driver that you open. So now, in order to open up a new web driver, we kind of have to open up into a new. We kind of have to use the same code again to open up another driver because we successfully closed that. So the next thing I want to get at is this good practice of trying to pause your script sometimes in order to like not flag a bot detector, because I mentioned before that websites generally can detect your IP address. I mean, they know about it because you basically need to use an IP address to open up anything. So if they detect that your IP address for whatever reason is accessing a website like too many times, like they detect abnormal behavior or something, they could block you. And some people will try and get around this by using a virtual private network or VPN, which you could purchase online. There's a lot of them out there. And basically it changes up your IP address to different, it changes up your IP address and alternates it to different places around the world or something. And you could set it up. And then you could run your IP, you could run your your web scraper through a VPN. That's one way that people do this. And you can look that up yourself. But another way to do this is just to add in pauses for your code. And I think this is generally a good best practice, especially for websites that are smaller, so you don't just overwhelm the website and crash it. And so I want to introduce you to this other library that I think is useful. It's the time library right here that we imported, and it gives you this fun method called sleep. We type in time.sleep, and if we run this, it's just the code's just gonna pause for 5 seconds, or the script is gonna pause for 5 seconds basically. And this is useful because you can set it up to as many seconds as you want. And so I'm going to illustrate one example here using this website. Okay. Wait, it's going to go to this foreign language press survey page. There's a lot here, but what I would pay attention to here is there's page 1 out of page 5038. So there's apparently like 50,000 articles here that we could potentially extract and get. And so I'm not sure the robots.txt file is here, but one thing that we could do is just run a for loop that literally clicks through every page, just nonstop, which is fine. But I think one of the problems here that I mentioned is sometimes websites can detect abnormal behavior, and 2, sometimes you don't want to overwhelm a website, or you actually want to wait for a little bit of time for websites to load, because just like any other web browser, sometimes you want it to load so you actually know what's going on, and that's going to be useful later on in this workshop when we talk about something else. But let's say you want to go through every page, extract everything, but you also want to include pausing your script to maybe wait like 5 seconds or 10 seconds or something like that every like 5 or 10 pages. So it's like, or like if you want to go through like 100 pages and wait for like have your script sleep for maybe 15 minutes or something, to mimic like a person taking a break, like a human person taking a break. that's something you could do pretty easily in Python. So for instance, over here, we're going to set the max pages to 20, meaning that we're just going to iterate. We're just going to go through 20 pages, basically. You can set it up to as high as you want, probably around like as much as there are pages here. I'm just going to set it to 20 pages just for this illustration. So I wrote a for loop that for page number, which is just any sort of variable in range 2 to 20, meaning that it's going to go, page number is going to go through, is going to begin at 2 and end at 19, I believe, because of Python indexing. And so what it's going to do is go through pages. It's going to run through this loop, I think 18 times or something like that. And what we're going to do is, we're going to have a print statement to show that it's accessing this page. And it's good to have print statements throughout your text because you want to know, in case your script breaks somewhere, you want to know the location of where it breaks. So it's kind of a debugging tool in a way. And I think that'll become obvious when I run this for loop. And then we're gonna access the element. We're gonna access this next page, basically. We're gonna find where it is, and then we're gonna tell Selenium to click it. And but the other thing we want to do is, remember, we want to pause the script for a certain number of times. So what I've written here is like an if statement. So every run, it's gonna check to see if this is true or false, the statement over here. And if it's true, we're going to give it a 5-second breather, or you can set it up as much time as you want, maybe a 10-second, 20-second, or maybe you want to set it to 15 minutes. And if it's true, it's gonna run this code. If it's false, it's just going to skip on to the next item on the for loop. So if it began at 2, it's going to begin at 3, and so on and so forth. And specifically this code right here, I think this percentage sign means get the remainder of the left number when you divide it by the right number. It might be kind of weird, but for instance, 5 divide, I think that's a divisor or something. I forgot what it was, but 5 percentage sign 5. That's 0 because 5 divided by 0 is 5 divided by 5 has a remainder of 0. Let's say we have 6 percentage sign 5. It's a remainder of 1. And so I think that that's like a useful sort of logic way to figure out that, in this case, it means that if the page is divisible by 5, so basically for every 5th page, let's take a break for 5 seconds. So I'm going to run this script right now, and you'll see what I mean here, what's going on. So you can see that the pages are changing, basically. And then it hit page 5, so it's going to take a 5-second breather. Page 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's pretty cool. It's basically automating on its own. And in between the code, you could tell Selenium to extract the titles or the text of each article. So it's a very useful tool to it's a useful way to web scrape and scale. Because I think last workshop, all we did was focus on web scraping specific one web page at a time, basically. Whereas this kind of a for loop allows you to web scrape on scale and basically select the next page in an automated way. And this pause button is very useful in order to give the scraper a pause break, to not overwhelm the web page, but also to not maybe flag an abnormal behavior. Although that's kind of difficult to do, but this is I think it's a good practice to include pauses in a way. And so as you see, we stopped at page 19, not at 20, because Python indexing is kind of weird. It doesn't go all the way there. But I hope that kind of illustrates to you, the importance of a pause button.
So just while we're on the topic, Todd, sometimes it helps to add a random component to your pause. If you're scraping from websites, sometimes that put barriers, or they don't want to be scraped as frequently. If they notice a routine pause, they'll block you out. So sometimes it's good to add a kind of I always put like a random number added to the base.
No, that's a really good suggestion. And yeah, exactly. There's a library for that. You could set it to like randomize a pause between like 2 to 5 seconds or whatever interval. And it just chooses a random number in between. So there are libraries out there, and that's relatively easy to implement. You can look that up, but that's a good suggestion, Scott. Thanks. All right. And I think this, let's see, we're closing in on time, but so we could talk a little bit about this this other element, this other method that Selenium comes with called implicit and explicit weights. I think I'm focused more on the explicit weights because they're more, I think they're more important with what we're doing, which is selecting elements. So basically, maybe for like more complicated web pages, you'll notice when you open up web pages, sometimes some web pages actually don't load everything up at once. Meaning that like sometimes when you open up a web page, you would expect everything to load at once, but because websites are complicated, sometimes some parts of the web pages that we might want, like maybe the data part of the web page that we want, actually doesn't load up until a certain amount of time. So like maybe different parts of a web page open up at different times. And that would be difficult. That makes things complicated for us, because that means if you want to select a certain element on a web page, sometimes you get an error. I think you'll get the error like a timeout error or a cannot find element error, even though the element is already there on the web page itself. It can't detect it because the element hasn't loaded on the web page. It's when you open up the browser, and that get really annoying for many different reasons, as you can imagine. If there's something that you want, it hasn't loaded yet. So an explicit weight, explicit and implicit weights are like different methods to deal with that. I think explicit weight specifically tells a command to wait for a specified amount of time in order to access a specific element. So for instance, if we want to select like we want to select like a certain element on a page with one of the methods that we used earlier, like driver find element. The explicit wait is basically it's its own method that you would run along with this. So it tells Selenium to try and access this web page, but if it fails, to wait a certain amount of time, and you could set it up to like 10 seconds or 20 seconds until either the amount of time that you set kind of finishes, or in which case the program will fail and run a timeout exception error, or it actually is able to select the element. And this is useful for cases in which sometimes it takes elements to load a certain amount of time to load. And so it doesn't automatically crash your program, or crash your script, or run an error in your script when you run something like this. So I think later on down the line, if you're running into a problem which some part of your web page is not loading correctly, it's not loading for whatever reason, you could wrap your like find by CSS selector or find by ID or whatever through a explicit wait command. And I'll give you an example with the website. So in order to be able to run explicit waits, we kind of need a couple of other, we kind of need to import a couple of other methods from the Selenium WebDriver library. So we're going to run this here, these three right here. Great. Oh yeah, and this is kind of going back to the documentation. You know, kind of weights are right here, actually. If you want to figure out more about what weights are, documentation is very useful because it kind of gives you, it's basically the code that I used here, and it gives you an example to use of how you would kind of run an explicit weight over here and an implicit weight down here, I believe. Yeah. So this is where documentation would be useful. And so we're going to run this website right here. I'm going to open up this driver. And it's going to go to this Medium article, again on coronavirus cases, specifically like we're downloading, similar to the previous one in Hawaii, we're downloading images of COVID-19 infection rates in Michigan state prison, state corrections facilities. So this is an example of a website where not everything loads at once, which is really annoying because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was the problem. Because sometimes when I just ran the regular, you know, web driver links like driver.findElements, it wouldn't work for a lot of reasons. It wouldn't work for whatever reason. And I figured out that basically, I would scroll down here, the images that I want down here wouldn't actually load unless I were to literally scroll down to them. So literally, they were basically undetectable until I indicated Selenium to scroll down and select them. Scroll down to where these images are. So this is an example of like a dynamic web page where not everything in the web page will load at once, and this can get really annoying, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I'm going to close that for a second. And so some of that, what you can do is you can actually automate your Selenium web browser to scroll downwards. So I'm going to run this code, and basically in order to scroll downwards, you would run this text, you would run this code right here. I'm going to open up the driver again. I'm going to open up web driver. You know, it takes a little while for this image to load, as you can imagine, as you can imagine. Wait for this to load as well. Okay, great. And so what this line of code does, it literally scrolls the window to this x-axis and this y-axis, as I stated here. So I think these are a number of pixels, I believe, or something like that. But basically, if I run this code, it should scroll down by 500 pixels. So I'm going to run this. There we go. You can see that the web page scrolled down a little bit. We could also do something like put this in a for loop in which, starting from pixels 1000 to 9000 in intervals of 300, scroll down the website. Let's run this right now. So what's literally going to do is just, you know, scroll down the page to regular intervals of 1 second, and it should load up all the images that I want, as you see here. While this is going through, I will be running through this, these explicit weight commands, and I think that'll be the end of the workshop after this. But so running an explicit weight is kind of finicky because of because you have to. I mean, you have a function WebDriver.weight, and you have your driver that you put in, and you have the number of seconds, which is 10, and this is basically telling it to wait for 10 seconds until it hits this, until it fulfills this until it fulfills this method, I believe, which in this case, it wants to detect the presence of the elements by ID, my dynamic element. So this first one will wait 10 seconds because there is no ID in this page called my dynamic element actually. So what you'll see here is an example of it, this function trying to find this element for 10 seconds. I'm going to run it here. And it's going to do this for 10 seconds, but little does it know that there's nothing here. But I think this is a good illustration to show, and eventually we get a timeout exception because the 10 seconds have passed. So this is kind of like illustrating that, if you set it for a number of seconds, it's going to literally wait until this element loads before it detects it. Or if it doesn't detect it, it's going to raise a timeout exception. Whereas if we run this code, there actually is a CSS selector here. So it should run immediately, actually. Yeah, there we go. And we could output this into, URL. We could get the src attribute, which is like basically the image, and then get the output URL. And sort of that's an example of an explicit wait. And I hope that gives you a sense of what's going on there. So I know we hit the 4 p.m. mark. So we got through a couple of different ways to troubleshoot websites. And I hope this sort of session was helpful for introducing you the kind of workflow that we want to use when we encounter any problems that we come across in web scraping. So I don't know if anyone has any questions before we break out, or if there's anything that I missed.
I don't have anything off the top of my head, but thank you, Todd.
Yeah, no problem. I know this could be pretty overwhelming, but the code is there that you could access in your own time, and so it takes some time to process it. It took me a long time as well. Cool.
Yeah, one thing about the process of writing this and getting your project to work is I'm assuming, Todd, it took you a while to figure out that you needed to scroll the page, and then you have to look up how to scroll the page. You have to figure out how far do I need to scroll the page, how to create the loop to scroll the page.
Yeah.
These things can take time.
Yeah.
When you get to those more complicated web pages. But that troubleshooting is a core part of this web scraping. There are always going to be these weird little edge cases where suddenly you're trying to interact with something that's in Java and you're like, oh my God, how do I do this? Why can I not click on this window? And then you have to look up, okay, so what does it mean that this is written in Java? How can I tell that this is written in Java? You have to start looking up things like, what is an iframe and what does that even mean? There's all these weird little things that eventually you'll run into, and that's just part of the process because of how varied the design of websites can be and how some websites are really, really old and really simple to deal with. And then other ones are really new and have all these weird interactive elements, and some are much more complicated. So the troubleshooting is a big part of learning it. And if you start a project and you run into something that is really confusing and the button is right there, like you can see it, you can click on it with your mouse, it works. Why can I not click on this? What is going on? That is normal. That is very normal, and there's always an answer. And it just takes a little bit of Googling to figure it out.
Yeah.
I have to head out, but thank you guys.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, Grace.
See ya.
Take care. I think we'll end the
Bye,
session.
Jacob. Yeah.
See you later, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.